Hi everyone, welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie, and for those of you who are new here, this is a channel where I read through all of the unread books on my bookshelf until we reach zero. Today I'm back to you with another monthly wrap-up, which we haven't had for a while, mostly because I was struggling for the last 3 months with Les Miserables. And if you haven't watched my last video, I recommend that you go and watch that for that particular part of the story. But now that I've finished kind of my big mammoth read of the year, I'm back to reading more books, and also more books that are sort of easy wins under my belt. I find that if I have a tortured read for a while, I need a few books to that are easy and fast-paced to get me back into my reading rhythm again. And so that's what I focus on in the month of June. I read 3 books. The first book that I read was one of the books that I bought on my trip to Korea, and that's Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by the Korean author Cho Nam-ju, and this is translated by Jae-min Chung. And so this is a really interesting book. It's quite thin and it's fast reading, so it's exactly what I needed. The book starts with the main character, Kim Ji-young, in the midst of a nervous breakdown. And then it goes back in time from her birth, being a particularly ordinary woman in South Korea, and then traces her life basically through to just after her marriage and the birth of her child, when she has this nervous breakdown. And it's a strange book because it describes what is otherwise an extremely banal life, except for the fact that her life is attended by these daily instances of misogyny that are not particularly significant, but obviously each one of them leaves these tiny scars on her. And I was a little bit ambivalent about this book until the ending. I thought the ending of the book was quite unexpected, and it was really cleverly done. Until then, I thought it was a little bit too on the nose with the feminist themes. There's a fine line between showing and telling. I prefer authors that show you something and get you to come to your own conclusions rather than sort of just hit you on the head with the point. And I find that this author doesn't quite get that balance right, but I thought the ending of this book really redeemed it. It took a level of confidence, I think, for an author to leave a book on the way that she did here. So, as I mentioned, I read this book right after I finished Les Miserables. And it was just the kind of contemporary, short, fast-paced book that I needed to cleanse my palate after struggling for 3 months with 19th century French romanticism. So I really enjoyed it. It was absolutely worthwhile getting, and it was a rather good book, I think, to buy on your travels as well, because I bought this while I was in Korea traveling, because it's if you wanted to read it right then and there, you would be able to get into it very quickly, but it's also a particularly good one if you just needed an easy win, which I absolutely needed after Les Miserables. So Kim Ji-young, born 1982, recommend from me. The second book I read in the month of June was The Motorcycle Diaries by Ernesto Che Guevara. So this was an unexpectedly fun book. I bought this book more than a decade ago. So when Borders shut all of its stores in Australia, they did a big sale, and I went and bought a lot of books from that sale. And I then proceeded to read very, very few of the books that I bought, and then spent the next decade gallivanting around the world and living in different parts of Australia. So, and all of these books just sat in my parents' house gathering dust until, of course, I returned from my gallivanting and set up shop myself, and where they sat unread on my own bookshelf for many, many years. So I feel like there's a lot of books actually on my bookshelf that come from that kind of period where Borders were shutting down and letting go of their stock. So my goal is to try and actually get through a few of them. And this was what I thought I would start with because it's a relatively thin book, and I also quite like the movie adaptation. So for those of you who don't know, the Motorcycle Diaries track the journey of Che Guevara and his friend Alberto as they traveled from Argentina, I think they started, and then they went all the way to Miami, although for all intents and purposes, the book kind of stops in Venezuela. And so if you know something about the geography of South America, they basically went from the bottom to the top. The motorcycle part is slightly misleading because the motorcycle in question sort of carks it about a couple of months into this journey, and Che Guevara and his friend, the two of them end up hitchhiking their way across South America with very little money. And I thought that was extremely impressive, the way they sort of just managed to get themselves onto the back of buses, slept anywhere they could, sometimes at police stations, sometimes at hospitals, and they managed to do this entire journey, it seems, on an absolute shoestring with no money and just the right attitude. And so I really, really love this book, and despite the fact that I've left it unread on my bookshelf for 10 years, I actually think that I read this book at the right time in my life, because in those 10 intervening years, I've actually then traveled to South America for the first time. And I took a journey overland from Argentina through Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. And the route that I took was unexpectedly quite similar to the route that Che Guevara took. Not because I knew about this book, but because it was a really logical, geographical way of doing it. And so having been to some of these places, I now come to this book with an appreciation that I wouldn't have had more than a decade ago of some of the places that he visited and how some of those places stayed the same and in some respects, and then also changed in some respects. For example, Chile, back when he was traveling through that country, was in a really, really different place and under a completely different political regime to the Chile of today. So I really enjoyed that kind of contrast between reading about his experience and then reading about and then thinking about my experience at the same time. But also, the geopolitics aside, what I really loved about this book was just how completely carefree and hilarious Che Guevara and his friend were. The two of them basically pretended to be leprosy experts, even though neither of them, I think Alberto was a qualified doctor and Che Guevara at the time was going to medical school. So he wasn't even a doctor, and the two of them pretended to be leprosy experts, and they sort of moved their way from town to town, visiting leprosy camps and staying at local hospitals and getting introductions and being hosted by these doctors who are thinking, well, these two leprosy experts are visiting town, I better take them out to dinner. So it's a little bit deceptive, but in a kind of hilarious and relatively trivial way. And I was also relieved ultimately about that there was very little politics in these books. There is some politics in the sense that Che Guevara kind of comes to the conclusion that Latin America should be the one country, that he has a real sense of Pan-Americanism by the time he finishes his journey. But that aside, I was worried that there would be a lot of Marxism or communism in this book, because while he took this journey before he became a political leader in Cuba, he published it later on, and I was afraid that in the process of publishing, he might have been tempted to go back and edit his notes from the time to make it seem more revolutionary. And he didn't do that. There was very little communism in this book until I think the second last chapter, which was written sometime after the journey ended. So aside from that, the book was more or less free of the kind of Cold War politics that I had been expecting. The book works because you get to see that 24-year-old version of him, that carefree, empathetic, and bohemian side of him. And he was utterly charming in this book. So if you have ever wondered what the Motorcycle Diaries is like, I highly recommend it. It was much better written than I expected. It was much more charming than I expected. So this was a perfect antidote to get me back into the rhythm of reading again. My month of great reading continued in June as I finished off the month with Morris by Ian Forster. So I read Ian Forster for the first time last year when I read Where Angels Fear to Tread, and that was Ian Forster's first published novel. And this is his last. This was published in the 1970s, but it was written in 1914. And for reasons that will become obvious as you read the book, Ian Forster did not feel that he could publish this book in his lifetime. And so between Where Angels Fear to Tread and when this book was written in 1914, there was about a decade or slightly over a decade gap. And I expected Ian Forster to become a better writer in that time between these two books. I just wasn't expecting him to have become such a good writer. I mean, this book I thought was almost perfect. Ian Forster tells the story of Morris, who was a young man with a middle-class upbringing. And throughout the book, Morris realizes that he's gay, and then he tries to confront his own homosexuality in various ways. And the novel charts that journey of self-discovery, of struggles with his own identity, and struggles with society and societal expectations, but also ultimately it's about his search for happiness and self-acceptance and self-love. And what I really loved about this book is the fact that Morris is not at all what you'd expect of a hero of this story. He is not often a sympathetic figure. He can be extremely petty and narrow-minded. He's not particularly bright. He's sort of this Edwardian middle-class white man with very little to distinguish himself. He's not your typical hero. And yet Ian Forster makes you feel for him. He makes you want Morris to find some measure of happiness and self-acceptance and relief from the repressiveness of the society around him. I think my favorite part of the book is not actually the theme of homosexuality, but the theme of class, because I knew the book was about a homosexual relationship. So that part of it was expected. What was totally unexpected was the class dynamics that came out between Clive and Morris, two of the main characters, and also Scudder and Morris. I thought it was very cleverly done, but not overdone. And Ian Forster wrote in the afterword of this book that it was important to him that two men at the time could be given a happy ending in fiction that they might not have gotten in real life. And I was thinking, reflecting back on this book and thinking that it was ironic because I think if this book had been written in 2024, we probably wouldn't have had that happy ending. It was because Ian Forster really wanted that happy ending in fiction that he couldn't get in reality, that we got this happy ending as part of Morris. And I think that says something about the role of fiction and what we need from it when we read fiction in order to escape from reality. So it's a phenomenal book, great characters, the pace was just right, not particularly long either. So if you are ever wanting to give Ian Forster a try, I would highly recommend this book. I haven't read Howard's End or his other major works, but I really thought this was almost perfect. So that's it. That's what I read in June. We have Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, by Cho Nam-ju. We have Che Guevara's Motorcycle Diaries and Morris by Ian Forster. Three different authors writing at three different periods in history and writing from three different continents. So very happy with the mix of books and sort of getting back into the rhythm of reading again. That's all for this month and I'll see you very soon. Bye, BookTube.